All right, we'll get started. So welcome. If we haven't met, my name is Amy Pold, and I work for the USGS Northwest Pacific Islands Regional Office, where all of my time goes to the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership, or PNAP for short. So welcome, and thanks for joining us today for the CDI Data Visualization Collaboration Areas Spring Webinar. And we are super excited to have Alvin Chang from The Guardian as our featured speaker today. If you've been to one of our webinars before, we're going to mix it up just a bit from what we've been doing. After we wrap up the welcome, we'll go straight to the presentation from Alvin, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. Then we'll cover announcements and do some live polling. And then if anyone's interested in sticking around, turning on their cameras and saying hello, the organizers will be hanging out and we would love to hear from you. But before we get to the presentation, I'm going to share a few tips. Please make sure you're muted when you're not speaking. If you're on the phone, you can use *6. And if you're using your computer for audio, you use that microphone icon on the toolbar. And depending on what version of Teams you're using, that toolbar might be fixed at the top right of the meeting window, or you might need to hover your mouse to get it to appear near the bottom middle of the meeting window. As we go along, if a question comes to mind, you should feel free to put that in the chat and we will circle back to those questions during the Q&A. And if you're having difficulties with the meeting platform, assuming that you can get to the chat, you can post issues you're having there and we will do our best to help you out right away. When we get to the Q&A, in addition to typing questions for Alvin into the chat, you can also raise your hand using that hand icon on the toolbar, and we'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, that is it for tips, and I'm going to pass it over to Ellen.
Hello. So,
oh, not Alvin.
Hey. Oh,
not Alvin.
Oh, Ellen.
We're going to Ellen first. Sorry, Ellen.
I was not ready for this slide.
Not enunciating. Okay, Ellen.
That is very confusing that our names sound so similar. Alvin, I think I've told you a little bit about who we are as Community for Data Integrations DataViz chapter, our collaboration area. So I'll tell you a little bit about this, even though it might be a repeat, but also for people who haven't joined us at one of our webinars yet, this is also for you. This is just to tell you a little bit about us. CDI is a big group within the USGS, but also is open to people beyond the USGS, all interested in data integration of some sort. We all work with data on some level. Our collaboration area specifically is focusing on data visualization, all the way from the very technical side of what tools and how do we do this, all the way to the how do we communicate this information supported by data, how do we tell stories with it, how do we use it to communicate science. So our goals as a collaboration area are right up on the screen. We want to create an open community for people to connect with each other, for practitioners to gain exposure to a diversity of skills, tools, perspectives, all sort of circling in orbit around this field of data visualization. We also want to act as a resource for data visualization guidelines and best practices kind of within this sphere that we live in of sort of federal service, kind of science exploration, and anything in between. And we also want to connect with others. It's really hard to make new connections in this very remote world, but we want to set aside time through these webinars once a quarter to connect with people and also set up other tools for us to connect outside of webinars. So Katie later in the hour will tell you a little bit more about ways we can do that, like through our Teams channel. But you're at the main event right here, the quarterly webinars that we do where we talk with people who are doing data visualization in fields even outside of the ones that we normally spend our full days in. So that's us. I don't think I introduced myself. Really quick, I'm Ellen. I'm a data visualization specialist. I work and live in Boston, but I'm in the water mission area in the data science branch, where I work with another one of the organizers on here on this team, Colleen Nell. We communicate USGS water science for the modern web, and it's super fun. But I know Alvin because I'm also finishing up a master's program at Northeastern University, and I took a data journalism class last year where the professor happened to have worked with Alvin. He the professor worked at the Boston Globe, and he invited Alvin to come speak to one of our classes, and I was blown away by all of the amazing work that Alvin had done. Currently, Alvin is a senior data reporter at The Guardian. He uses everything from charts to cartoons to tell data-driven stories about educational inequalities, voting rights, the climate crisis, and he's worked at the Wall Street Journal and at Vox, and his work is really amazing. So I'm really honored that when I reached out to him to ask if he would be interested in speaking to CDI, that he said yes, and we're lucky enough to have him here today. So with that, I will pass this over to you, Alvin, so we can stop sharing our screen and you can pop on, say hi, and start sharing your screen.
Awesome. Here, I'll show myself for a second. Hello. So I'll talk a little bit about who I am, and then I'll jump into a presentation. And I have to warn you that this presentation, I had an epiphany last night of a thing I do when I tell data stories, and I thought, why don't I make a presentation about it while I work through my thoughts? So you guys are my complete, you're my test group. So this has never been done before. So as Ellen said, I'm a data reporter at The Guardian. I run the data and graphics projects at Guardian US, which is the US branch of The Guardian. And before that, I decided I had this brilliant idea of having 3 jobs in 2020. So I was at Vox and the Journal and at The Guardian, all in 2020. And of course, nothing else was going on in 2020. So it was super calm and awesome. But I think, you know, so I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. How do I? Okay. Do you guys see this?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Do you guys still see this?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I kind of wanted to walk through a storytelling pattern that I saw in my stories, and then in stories that I really liked, in the data stories that I really liked. And I'll walk through that with a project I did a few years ago. And so a few years ago, I had a researcher reach out to me, and he said, you know, I have some analysis that looks at whether or not school attendance zones make segregation worse. So if you went to school in the US, you know that for the most part, people go to school based on where they live, public school. And what he was proposing was, he was saying he has some data, or a lot of data, looking at whether those lines actually make racial segregation better or worse. And so, you know, I did what I usually do. I went out, I scripted a story, I found the data, analyzed a bunch of data, found a way to present it, all of that. And then a few weeks ago, I was looking at that piece and a few other pieces that I had done and I really liked from other people, and I realized there was kind of a pattern. So I wanted to kind of talk through what that pattern looks like. So first, I realized one thing that I really enjoy is framing the problem. So I think a lot of times when we tell data stories, or tell any story, there's kind of a tension that you want to establish of, you know, what's the question we're trying to solve, or what's the problem we're trying to explore. And so for this piece, the very first visual you see here has nothing to do with the core of the data. So what I established here was, the first visual I showed my reader was how segregated virtually every city in the U.S. is, every school district in the U.S. is. So each of these little areas within the map are school attendance zones. Everyone in those areas goes to the same elementary school if they don't opt out for private school. And so as you can see here, there's literally dark splotches in every one of these maps that just kind of cluster together. And it shows, you know, something that is establishing base knowledge that there's a huge amount of racial segregation in virtually every American school district. And then the next thing I established is that school segregation has actually gone backward. The integration was relatively successful early on, and then in the past 30 or so years, we've kind of gone backwards, and Black students who are in heavily segregated schools, that number is actually going up. And so that's the second thing. And then the third thing I established was, you know, this thing that I told you really early on, which is that you usually go to school based on where you live. And for the most part, you go to the school that's closest to you, or you would expect to go to the school that's closest to you. And I think this is where a lot of cartoons come in, where they're just very basic. They're just fancy diagrams of drawn by a person who can't draw anything that doesn't have a right angle. That's me. So this is kind of the pinnacle of this section of I'm trying to explain the problem. So on the left here, it says if kids go to the nearest school, it would recreate the underlying residential segregation. And that's because, as I established earlier in the piece, that there's already a lot of residential segregation because of America's past laws and redlining and amongst other things. And so if we were just to say, hey, everyone just go to the closest school, then you just recreate the underlying segregation. But these lines are completely fungible. You get to draw them however you want to draw them with some rules. And it's possible to gerrymander in a positive way to make these school zones more integrated, more racially diverse, so that each school is more racially diverse or not. And so the question that I've been working up to is, what does the data say about how American school districts do this? Do they do the thing on the left, or do they do the thing on the right? And so in this section, I immediately answer the question. Here's the overview of the data. For the most part, it's at or around 0. It doesn't make most districts just keep segregation at about the same level as the underlying neighborhood. So they're not using this tool, right? They're not using this these district boundaries to make it better or worse. They're just letting the status quo sit as is. And I think it's really important to do this work, this early work of establishing what the problem is, asking a really distinct question that my reader knows the stakes of that question, and then answering that question. But there's a part of the story that I always kind of strive for, which I'm calling the aha moment. But it's the part of the story where you give the reader what they want, and it's the thing that sticks in their head, and they hopefully, if you do it right, they don't forget it. And here, my aha moment was that, okay, now that I've shown you the entire data set, now I want to let you zoom into your district. And I think personalization of data sets has been around for a while, but I think a lot of times you see tools that do this first, that give you the personalization up top. And it's kind of like revealing in a movie what the twist is, and then backfilling it in with the background. And I don't like that. I don't like when people get to personalized data, but they don't actually know the stakes of what they're looking at. So here I've kind of laid out the stakes, and then now we're personalizing data. So here I think I input the Charlotte Mecklenburg district in North Carolina. And so this map is showing, and you can look up any district in the US. I think it's got like 99% coverage, but this map is looking at what the racial makeup of every elementary school in the Charlotte Mecklenburg district would be if everyone went to the nearest school. And so you can see it's basically showing you the underlying residential segregation. And you can see there's quite a bit of it. And then this map is showing you how the district lines are actually drawn. So, I like to go back and forth. I should have picked an example where it's a starker difference. You can see that for the most part, the Charlotte Mecklenburg School District recreates that underlying segregation. Then I show, this is, there's a whole section that explains scatter plots because I never understand them. So I always like to explain how to read a scatter plot. But here I'm saying, if everyone goes to the nearest school district or the nearest school, then the neighborhood segregation is just recreated. So you can see it just goes perfectly along that 45-degree axis. The underlying segregation is being recreated. So the percent students of color in the attendance zones and the percent students of colors in each neighborhoods are the same. And then I have a section that does a little reveal and shows you that here's how it actually is in reality. And some school attendance zones make it better, some make it worse. And so this is the portion that you kind of get, you get what you want. I've given you a big problem, and then I've told you, okay, here's how it actually affects your district. And so I think a lot of times it took me forever to find this GIF, so please appreciate. A lot of times, I think once you've established a problem and you've established it in some depth, people start to immediately problem solve. I think when people see something that's broken, they want to problem solve and say, okay, how can we solve this? Like, it's broken. What is broken about it? And so the very last chapter of my stories tends to go into, okay, like, here's how to think about the problem. Now that I've shown you there is a problem, here's how to think about the problem. And I guess I say, here's how to think about what's next. And so, I think immediately the reaction is, okay, well, if these attendance zones are so segregated, then we should focus on that, right? And I immediately kind of throw a wrench in it and say, well, actually, the larger segregation is between districts. So a district in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, for example, Charlotte-Mecklenburg and a neighboring district probably have way more racial way more disparity in their racial makeup than two attendance zones within Charlotte-Mecklenburg. And so I'm sure, and whenever you kind of like establish that, people always say, oh, then of course you should bus people from one district to another, right? Because that's kind of the solution. And if you paid attention to politics in the last year, you know that that is not a super popular solution, and B, it's the Supreme Court has made that significantly harder than just doing it. It's you actually just can't do it in most places. And so I'm laying out kind of constraints of here's how to think about a problem and what's possible. And again, I'm doing another kind of diagram, essentially showing what the constraints are. So here, in a Supreme Court case, I believe in 2013, they said that this is not allowed. So you can't assign students to a school based on race. But this is allowed. You can assign students to a school district based on where they live and residential zoning patterns. And so I'm just kind of laying out, okay, as you think about solutions, here are some of the constraints. Another thing I visualize here is that research shows that when you have these very regularly shaped zones, school zones, ones that look like they are not segregated or are not gerrymandered, they actually tends to be more segregation with those shapes than the more irregularly shaped ones. And you can kind of start to understand, you can kind of logic your way to why that might be. If the underlying residential segregation was done in ways that were designed to be beneficial to one group, you would expect them to be regular, quote unquote, regular shape. And so in order to kind of get around that, you can create these like irregularly shaped ones to address the underlying problem. And I realized I just do this over and over again. Like, I am so boring because literally this is the storytelling method I use over and over and over again. And it's the kind of thing that I really enjoy. And so here, it made me think about why I do this. And I think this is a little cartoon of, if you've ever seen these cartoons that look like this, I made them at Vox to try to kind of do some storytelling with them, but I clearly didn't know how to make anything but rectangles in Illustrator, so that's why they look the way they are. And I guess I learned how to make a circle for this one, but I think one thing I think about a lot is what do my readers do with new information, with information that is hard to kind of figure out where to put in your brain or where to fit into existing mental models in your head. So for example, a lot of times I think what people do is we try to take new information and plop it into some existing way of thinking about something. And this is often called assimilation. We try to say like, okay, I think I understand how this augments the way I think about this thing. And often it's not quite right. And so I think what I'm aiming for is what's often called accommodation, which you're actually having to create a whole other model in your head or in the reader's head or in your audience's head so that they can actually think about it in a slightly more accurate way. And none of these models are like actually correct, right? They're just little shortcuts for our brains to think through difficult problems. But I think it's important to kind of understand, are you augmenting existing knowledge that you're assuming, knowledge that you're assuming people already have, or are you trying to establish some other model in their head so they can think through a problem? And a lot of times, I think with things that we want to spend a lot of time on, we're actually trying to do this thing. We're trying to help somebody understand something completely new through a completely different lens. And so, there are many. I'm going to go through a few examples where, so this one is mine where I thought, oh, I'm doing the same thing over and over again. This is a piece about how, we argue that the Senate is broken. And actually, I'll read through each panel since I clearly want to do read along with kids here. So, okay, so it says, at the center of the broken Senate is something all American school children learn. Every state gets 2 senators. This chart shows every US senator in 1950 and how many people they represented. And since every state gets 2 senators, regardless of population, some states get a lot of representation, other states get very few, and that's always been true. And so this is the whole building up the problem part of this. This disproportionate representation wasn't a huge deal in 1950 because both Democrats and Republicans represented about the same number of states, big and small. But in 1950, you can see that we're actually organizing it so you can see that slightly clearer. 1960, Democrats won more votes, but there was still about an even distribution. 1970. So here I'm still establishing that problem. And then I'm eventually going to go to an aha moment, or going to it. So by 1980, a trend started to emerge. Democrats were more likely to represent bigger states. Republicans represented many smaller states. 1990, 2000, Democratic senators represented nearly 3 million more people, but Republicans still held the majority. 2010, Democratic senators represented 74 million people, but they failed to get the supermajority. And then here is today, 50-50. And so here I've kind of given you the aha moment, and then the rest of this, it's up to the rest of the piece to kind of help you think through the problem. And we walk through some of the big issues that are stopping this problem from being solved. And I believe we get into things like the filibuster and basically everything that Congress is yelling about right now. And so some of my favorite pieces actually do the exact same thing. So this is a piece on a website called The Pudding that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I'm actually just going to go to this part. It says, here are the front pockets and 80 pairs of blue jeans. Check out the average sizes for both women and men. Our measurements confirm what we already knew. Every woman already knows to be true. Women's pockets are ridiculous. And it kind of goes, that's the big reveal. The building up of the problem was actually in this text up here. And then here we have the kind of aha moment. I just love this piece because they take such a, they're actually explaining a huge amount of information in such a concise and elegant way. And eventually they go to this little interactive that lets you try to fit different types of things in the average pocket. Oh, there we go. And lastly, there's this piece on the cost of healthcare. You're not going to be able to see the or hear, but basically what it's showing is, well, I guess I'm going to try to narrate this piece in live. So this is healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP. And now this video is building up what the problem is. Why is the US bar so high? And eventually the big reveal. It is not public healthcare spending, which is relatively in line with every other country. The reveal here is, it's coming. And there, it's going to do the reveal of it's actually private healthcare spending. And so I think I realized that that's a pattern I really enjoy, and so I just thought I'd talk about that today and see if anybody has any reaction to that. So this is my contact info, and I'll leave it up for half a second. But otherwise, I am happy to answer any questions or be yelled at if you completely disagree with me.
people want to turn on their audio or and give a big round of applause for Alvin, you can definitely do that. Or oh my gosh, thank you so much, Alvin. I can, if you want to put your contact information in the chat also, people can probably copy it from there as well. That was super fun. I really enjoyed that. So I'm going to moderate Q&A for the next 20-ish minutes. So the way that's going to work is if you guys have questions and you don't want to say them out loud, just type them in the chat box, or you can message me privately and I will read them out, or just raise your hand or interject during a break in between questions, and you can unmute yourself and ask and turn your video on by yourself. I guess just to prime the pump, I loved this framing of how you start stories, like setting up a really useful question and leading up to an aha moment. I wonder if you can also tell us a little bit about how you find a good end. I think the aha moment like reveals a good end, but one of these challenges that I see a lot with scientists that I work with trying to communicate their science is that the problem in the aha moment has multiple causes. And so when you get to this problem solving mode, it's like, where do I even begin? Do I just list the one? Do I just list all of them and say nothing else about them? What advice would you have kind of from a journalistic standpoint or a storytelling standpoint for finding the end point of setting up this story?
Yeah, I think a thing that a lot of us data people want to do is we want our presentation of the data to do everything. We want it to do everything for everyone. And we run into this problem of it, then it becomes useful to nobody. And I think, or we want it to, we don't want a particular audience, and we want to be very neutral about the story we're telling. And there is no such thing as neutral. Let me tell you, folks, if you are neutral, then you've made a whole bunch of decisions without actually thinking about them and hoping that you're not pissing anyone off. And I think that ends up kind of biting you a bit, because you end up not being clear to anyone. And so I think if you are presenting to, let's say, I don't know, I'm just completely, let's say you're like an expert on like water quality or something, and you're presenting to a whole bunch of people who would be wanting to dig through that as reference material, to dig through it to, I don't know, maybe actually as part of their jobs, and spend a lot of time with it. I think it's fine to just have a multiple finding. That aha moment is really exciting for those people. But if you're publishing something, for example, I remember there was a CDC site on the number of people who had died of opioid overdoses, and it tried to be everything to everyone, and eventually they got the data wrong, or they portrayed the data incorrectly, because they wanted it to be both for people who were experts, but also most of the people who ended up using it were just the layman, just coming in and looking for that top line data point. And so I think you kind of have to be clear about that. And I think you can kind of get around it by labeling things really clearly. But the aha moment doesn't have to be magical. It doesn't have to be this like big thing or this existential thing. It's just a way of kind of thinking about where you're heading with your story, because then it forces you, okay, who am I building this for, or who am I talking to here? Ellen, I think you're muted.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah, I think that question of who are you talking to, who is your audience, is also a really interesting one. I want to lift up a question from the chat asking about which kind of comes first. How do you go about picking a story or a data set that you want to work with?
Okay, hold on. Someone asked for the link to the PowerPoint, so I'll drop that in there now. Okay, so the question was, how do you go about picking a story or data set? So I often pick a story first. I think, so you guys get a little view into my worldview. I think there are a lot of urgent problems now, and the solutions to those problems seem to all be moonshots. They seem to be very difficult for humanity to achieve. And so I think, it's not hard to start from the story, but I often think, and I actually don't start by seeking out data sets. I actually start by seeking out what questions I want to answer, what I want to clarify, what kind of how I want people to be thinking about the problem. And then when I go to answer the problem, it's almost always with data, because I think that's, I can say this here because it's a really cool way to answer a question while also helping someone think about something in a productive way, a topic in a productive way. So so these days, a lot of my work is with around climate, around climate and voting rights, or some kind of democracy reform, I suppose. Those are like the two big things that I've spent a lot of time around. But I spent a lot of time before on school segregation, on school funding, and so I think I don't know if that answers your question, but story first, story always first. I always see data as a tool, a good tool to answer questions in a systematic way, but not I never twist around a story for data or to make the data work. And I see another one in here. Is it okay if I just read it?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. What a cool framework for storytelling or telling stories with data. Thank you. Do you have any advice for how to use data visualizations if they're one small element of a larger article? How does that change how you think about the data viz? Yeah, I think, I think if you actually look at like how people navigate through websites, it's like you lose 90% of people past the headline or the title of the piece, and then you lose like another 9% before you get to the bottom, right? And so you get an astoundingly small portion who actually like consume the piece, but they always will stop at the data viz and just quickly take a glance at it to see if that makes sense. And I think I'm always striving, if I get one visual element, right? If I get one thing that is a different element that someone's eyes will gravitate toward, I'm always thinking, does this capture the directionality of the piece? Like, does it suggest the right thing? Because I think otherwise you're kind of not doing justice, not taking advantage of that space. So that's kind of how I think of that. I think Ellen froze. Am I frozen, or is everyone else here?
You're not frozen. I can see you just fine.
Okay,
but
great.
I may have gone very still.
Great. And okay, see another question. Lately, I've heard a lot about the technique of key message or aha first, and then explanation later. With your technique of framing first and then building to the aha, how do you grab a user and get them to stay and read on? I found that people want to learn. I mean, like you don't get the. I think if you get the aha first, that means that you are delivering a aha moment with a lot of assumed knowledge. Like you're coming to a piece of content with a lot of assumed knowledge, and if you have that assumed knowledge, you get the aha moment. If you don't have the assumed knowledge, you don't get the aha moment. It's like you're not in on the joke if you don't get that. And so I always hint at the aha moment of what question I'm going to help answer for you, but I think it's important to kind of build up the importance of that question or the context in which that question was answered. Because otherwise these like independent data points not attached to anything are completely meaningless. And it's just at the mercy of the context that someone's bringing to a story. So I think that context is really important.
Yeah, totally.
Questions?
Again, reminder, if you guys want to unmute yourself and ask a question without typing it into the chat, or you just want to make a comment, you're also welcome to just raise your hand using Teams, or just go ahead and unmute yourself. I wanted to bounce off, though, that last comment that you just made, which I thought was the metaphor you used for like setting up a joke. Is not funny if you don't have the setup for a joke when you get to the punchline, and it's also not as powerful of an aha moment if you don't have the context or understand kind of the stakes that are leading up to that. And I had never thought about it quite with with that metaphorical lens, and I really like that.
I also think we kind of have a responsibility to make sure that our data is interpreted in an accurate way or with the correct context. And I think if you if you ignore that part, if you hope that people are coming in with the right context, which I think, it happens quite a bit, then you're doing a disservice to your data. Okay, I see another question. When selecting the audience for data viz, it's easy to fall back on the vague, ill-defined general public. Yes, it is. How do you identify a more careful, narrow target audience? Figure out how to target that audience. I always think about what is the assumed knowledge that someone comes in with to the piece, instead of like, I'm looking for, I think if if you work for like some company that does like product design or something, they would probably be like, let's create personas of like who we're targeting. I always kind of cringed at those, and I think I'm more, okay, the things that that I try to cover should be relevant to everyone, but what kind of knowledge am I assuming? And sometimes it cuts off like the experts. Like an expert will come to the piece and they'll be like, yep, I know what I'm looking at. I don't need to read this. Or I'll cut off like the beginner, someone who has no base knowledge or about like American democracy. I'll just, I'll actively cut that out. But I think instead of target audience, I just think what is already in someone's head when they come to the piece. And I know it's quite a lot. It's it's a scary exercise to kind of partake in, because you realize just how much everything we communicate has so much assumed contextual knowledge. And I think that ends up being really non-inclusive when we don't have that conversation. Okay, I'm going to go through these questions and then go to the hands raised. So it says, I appreciate the simple, clean graphics. Do you see any specific cases where 3D viz is useful? I do. I really love 3D in mapping. I think like a lot of traditional data viz or like Edward Tufte type data viz that's supposed to be like super clean. I think our philosophy has often been like, get information across first. But one thing that that some research actually shows is like 3D charts are actually really effective. And I think that when we use 3D charts to like make a bar chart, obviously that like has some communication issues. But I think in maps it ends up being really interesting, because I think our brains are really good at interpreting if things are popping out of a map, or for example, I did a piece on, actually I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. So can I share this? I've become convinced it's possible to share a screen without saying you're going to share a screen. Okay. So this is a piece I did on let's see, hold on. There we go. So this is a piece I did on where people work versus where they live. And I'm representing population with things popping out of the ground. Sorry, you're going to see it crap out here. Actually, I have a better idea. I'll show you the video instead. There we go.
Nice.
Okay, so this is showing you Chicago. And this was made in JavaScript, so it's just your usual 3D map. And this is showing you where there are more white people and fewer white people when people are at work. And then when they go home, you can see it gets way more segregated. And we can see the inverse here. I think I'm going to show Chicago. Yeah, so more black people, fewer black people. And this is where people work. And I think, yep, and then I show you the inverse here. So I think that actually works really well, the kind of 3D effect here, just because we're really good at reading it. But I don't know, I'm not a stickler for insisting something look a certain way. Let me unshare. Did I unshare already?
Yeah, you just unshared.
Okay. Cool. Okay, any general advice for communicating uncertainty in data? Ooh, I'm gonna skip that one. I'm gonna just but it's got 9 likes. Jesus. I'm wrestling with this right now. I've wrestled with this question quite a bit because there's lots of like designy ways to get around to kind of get at uncertainty, but I've always thought the designy way of communicating uncertainty is like our brains actually aren't interpreting that correctly. Like our brains are automatically kind of placing it somewhere near the center of like an area chart. Yeah, I don't know. That one's hard. No wonder it's got 9. Can I like it too? Yeah, I just liked it. No, I can't like it. Yeah, I don't know. That one's hard. Okay, I think I need to go to the hand raised here. Daniel Warren.
Yeah. Hey, Alvin, thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me. I really enjoyed your talk. I was just curious, I looked at the Vox article online, and I think you mentioned how, kind of people's eyes of how they kind of scan web pages. And it comes to me that, even beyond having a great story and kind of how you tell that story, there's a key element of just like good design that kind of either kind of has that story hit or miss. And like I was looking at that Vox article, and on the Find Your District, the little button that says like your state, the button wiggles. It's a tiny little design touch, but I think it really makes it powerful, and it drew my eye. And so I was just curious if you could talk about once you kind of go through that flow, if you're working at Vox, do you do the web design? Do you work with developers? Like, what's that relationship like? I'm curious to see kind of in a real world product, kind of what a workflow might be. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So at every place I've been the one who is doing the journalism and then trying to figure out how to present it the best way possible. And so a lot of times, I think there are some projects that are where the workflow is a lot more like a product, where you're essentially making something, going through QA testing, going through user testing, going through I've just never worked at a place that had those resources. And so what I usually do is I show it to everyone I can and try to take advantage of the first time they see it. And then if there's anything that they're confused by, if I can look over their shoulder, the better. Then this is the jankiest way to troubleshoot UX design, but that's kind of become the way the kind of way I have adopted. But I also think some of it comes with being bad at it a lot. Like, I've probably made 200 things that look like that in my lifetime, and probably the first 170 of them were terrible, and people didn't actually click on the right thing, and you can see it in the analytics where it's like, oh, no one actually clicked on that button. And I think that's something that I think is useful, and to gather analytics on how people use things. And so at any place that allows me to gather analytics, I've definitely done that. Did I answer your question there?
Yeah, no, I think you did. And I just, I work for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I think something I'm always struck by is that we have kind of good data sometimes, and I think we have good stories, but sometimes we're missing kind of the technical skill sets to kind of convey that in a nice kind of flashy website that has kind of really good, clean design. I think you address those points really well. And I think that just, it's great. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I see. I'm going to try to answer Wayne's question and then Vanessa's question here. And I think then I have to jump to my next Zoom call. So Wayne's question was, how much time and effort is necessary to develop a full data story? I don't think I plan for sufficient development time. I think, the last 10% is going to take 50% of the time in a lot of the polish and making sure, like in that previous question of, whether people are clicking on the right things and all of that. And I think you can simplify that significantly, and if you don't need it to be perfect, I guess. If you just are making sure people are doing the right thing and clicking on the right thing, and obviously there's some sacrifice there. But for me, how much time and effort, it's that the piece I just walked through took about a month on and off. So probably a total of like 2.5 weeks. But a lot of it was waiting for the data or cleaning the data, or because the actual technical aspect of building something like that isn't, it's simply a few maps, right? It's a few interactive maps and a whole bunch of drawings that are squares essentially. But I think where I think where a lot of the time goes in is in the concept, in okay, what are the things I'm going to have to illustrate and how am I going to illustrate it. I always try to have a central metaphor that I'm working through, whether it's something that's like very similar to real life, like a map, or with Obamacare, I was using these like Jenga pieces to illustrate it, and I always try to have a simple metaphor that helps me get through the story. But I think figuring out what that is takes the most time. Talking to the dozens of sources, parsing through the data, making sure that the directionality of the piece is correct. So if I'm framing the piece correctly, I think that takes the most time. And the production end of it, it just depends on what the timeline looks like. Sometimes I'll push through something like that in like a day. It'll be super sloppy, but it, those are the constraints, right? Sometimes the timeline that you have to get something out is not very long. So yeah, I guess you got to get the content right, but I guess I'm less stringent or less anal about the design. Okay, and the last one here is more about the software and technology that I use to create. I spend most of my time in a Google Doc making tables that that are like scripts of things I need to touch on, things I need to cover, like sentences of like, I want to communicate this sentence extremely clearly. An exercise I do with I teach data viz to undergrads, and an exercise I do with them is I have them try to boil down a chart into a single sentence. And the rationale for that is I want them to know what they're trying to draw the reader to and make sure that's aligning with their design. And I think I try to I try to outline with those sentences in mind, and that way I can design for that end. Because I think a lot of times when I just say I'll use this, or I'll visualize this data here, and I'll visualize this data here, it's actually, like I was saying before, when you just visualize data without a purpose, or trying to just do it neutrally, it doesn't actually work out very well, because you end up the reader has to look at something first, right? And so yeah, I think those are the. I guess I've completely sidestepped that question. So I think the technology for mapping, QGIS, on the front end, a lot of Mapbox or Leaflet or Google Maps, depending on what we pay for. A lot of Illustrator, a lot of making simple things, simple shapes in either like Google Sheets with the chart tool, or making them directly in Illustrator. And let's see what else. The Senate thing we saw was just raw HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So those are actually just little all boxes with a background on them. So the technology is, there's nothing super fancy. The technology I use for data analysis is, I prefer Python, and so I use like Jupyter notebooks to organize myself a bit. But if I have to, I'll jump into R, or if I really, really have to, I'll jump into like a SQL, some SQL software. SVG, yeah. I mean, everything I try to do it in I try to find a way to get it into SVG so I can get it into Illustrator. And there's a really great tool called Illustrator library called AI to HTML, which I'll type in here, which actually exports out your Illustrator artboards into several screen widths so that they can be responsive. So you can have charts that appear pretty in mobile and desktop.
That's awesome. I had no idea about that last tool. I'm going to use that all the time. I know you have to get to your next thing, so maybe all of us can unmute and give you one last round of applause, because it has been such a pleasure getting to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And just 2 plugs. One is I am hiring for 2 positions, and I'm going to stick that. I mean, I'm not trying to poach from you guys or anything, but if you know people who you want to recommend to apply for these, please let me know. Hold on, let me find the other one. And then the last thing is, if you want to chat, I really just enjoy chatting. So feel free to reach out, and we'll schedule a coffee meeting over either Zoom, or it doesn't have to be Zoom. We could just do it on regular phone too. So thank you guys. This was really fun.
Thank you so much, Alvin. We'll let you go. For folks who want to stick around, we are going to stick around. Dion has some fun stuff planned, and we're also just going to be around to chat and turn our videos on and hang out. So thank you, Alvin.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to pass it over, I think, to Dion or Katie. Actually, Dion, you're going to share your screen, and Katie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie. I work for the USGS New England Water Science Center in the Hydraulics and Hydrology section. My expertise includes web application and website development, as well as working with a variety of GIS technologies. So now on to some of the latest announcements. If you haven't already checked it out, then definitely check out our Microsoft team. More information about how to join this team can be found on our Confluence wiki under the How We Connect section. We also have a really fun activity called Introduce Yourself with a Viz, which you can find in the Meet and Greet channel on this team. So check it out and see how you can participate. In other news, one of our organizers, Sophie Howe, had to take a step back from this group. And we want to say thank you, Sophie, for your valuable contributions, and we will miss you greatly. This also means that we are seeking another group organizer. So if anyone is interested in becoming more involved with this group, then please contact one of the current organizers listed on our Confluence wiki. All right, now over to Dion.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. This is Dion Zawani with USGS Cloud Hosting Solutions. We're going to switch gears right now and just get to know a little more about each other with a few quick polling questions before we close out today. So I guess I shouldn't have minimized that, but some of you may have used Slido during the monthly CDI meetings, but if you are unfamiliar, just open a new tab and head to www.slido.com, and then you can enter the code storytelling to join our polling session, or you can just click the direct link in the chat that'll be dropped. And I just wanted to say thank you for the folks who contributed to today's questions via the Microsoft team. We just have a few for you today. And this is my first time running Slido, so please be patient with me. All right, so I think as a few of you filter in, again, slido.com, code is storytelling. I'm going to start the first question here, which is just, where are you right now? So go ahead and type in, I believe it's a text box that you can enter into. On a chair, very literal. Funny how different
Planet
people. Yeah. In Oregon, Massachusetts, my couch, comfy. A lot of people in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm assuming a lot of people in water. A lot of people in Boston, Ellen.
Yeah, who else is here from Boston? You can either say hi or just in the chat or not at all. But I'm curious.
A yoga ball. All right. We'll move on to the next one, which is, what aspect of data viz do you struggle with the most? Framing the context. 508 compliance. I know that's a big one. The data part. Using the right viz type, the layout, scripting, learning new languages, data wrangling, designing for mobile. I've seen a couple people mention technical skills. storytelling. Finding the time to do it. Using the correct colors, all of this is great. And I believe we can keep this data, so it'll be interesting to look back on. Hiding the fact that I use Excel.
No shame in Excel.
Yeah, let me know how you do that. All right, we will go ahead and move on to the next question. What insight or advice from Alvin's talk stood out to you? This one you might have to think about a little bit. There's tons of great points. Importance of storytelling for sure. Using metaphors, building up to the aha moment, that was a big point. How to frame your story. How to be clear and concise. Your story first and then the vision data. So again, leading up to it. Keep it simple. Yeah. Yeah, what a great presentation. I really enjoyed that today. Cutting the beginners and experts out of the target audience. Explaining a scatter plot, that was a great point. Someone mentioned in the chat, we often take it for granted that people know how to read a scatter plot, so it's important to explain that. Conveying uncertainty and how we all struggle with it. All right, I think we're slowing down so we can move on to the last question, which is, what is your favorite source for discovering new data viz these days? A little bit of resource sharing. Twitter, the pudding. CDI?
Aw.
Lots of Twitter. New York Times.
Maybe we should have a Twitter roll call on our Teams channel, because there are a lot of people on Twitter, it looks like.
Yeah, drop your Twitters in the chat. Tableau. YouTube. A lot of folks mentioning CDI. That's great. Wait a few more seconds. The Data Viz Society. Colleagues. All right, I will go ahead and close this out. Thanks for everyone. Or thanks everyone for participating in that. Let me go ahead and share this again. I didn't totally mess up Slido. That's good. But again, thank you everyone for joining today. That was really great. A couple of housekeeping items before we close out the meeting. The first is just that, as always, like Katie mentioned, we encourage you to join the new CDI DataViz team. The instructions for joining that are posted on the wiki page, the CDI DataViz wiki page. Like she mentioned as well, once you do that, feel free to introduce yourself by posting your own data viz. We've been encouraging that for a while, and a few people have had some really great submissions so far. That could be something that you worked on in the past, or something that really inspires you, or that interests you. So you can go ahead and head over to the team and participate if you'd like. Of course, we've recorded today's webinar, and it will be shared through the listserv and also posted to Teams and our wiki page. So you'll be notified via those channels when it's ready. And then lastly, as we've mentioned, we encourage those of you who are passionate about data viz and are interested in contributing ideas or feedback to reach out to any one of us, any one of the planning members, if you'd like to join in our efforts. So our contact information is posted in the wiki as well. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining. A huge thank you to Alvin for the awesome presentation on storytelling with data, and for a very insightful and interactive Q&A session. Like we have done in the past, we'll be sticking around for a few minutes to just hang out and chat about either the content today, or what you're working on, or any ideas for future webinars that you have. So feel free to stick around and unmute and turn on your video if you'd like, or again, just contact any one of us. We're very excited to meet you and hear what you're working on. So we'll stick around. To the rest of you, thanks for joining, and we will see you next time.